something and you think to yourself, yeah, that looks fine, that reads fine. But somebody perhaps coming from another discipline or another way of approaching things reads things differently. And of course, the main thing for a probation officer in terms of writing for outside was writing for the courts and providing what we called social inquiry reports, more recently known as pre-sentence reports. And of course, you write something down, you think it's all right, but hey ho, maybe it's not quite as it should be. So there we go, slips of the pen. His father works for British Railways, but the court can see he's completely gone off the rails. Well, you know, you can see how the person put that in. It's all auto-suggestive, isn't it, really? There we go. Okay, I would say that the heydays of the probation officer, the independent probation officer, because they were very much, was between the middle of the 50s and the late 70s. Independent professionals working in a light touch organisational structure. And two things happened after that. And I'm not going to talk about what happened after that, but what happened after that were two major things. From the 1980s onwards, and many of you will recognise this, especially if you worked in any sort of public or large governmental body, managerialism appeared. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But there were more chiefs than Indians, as the old saying went, in many situations, not necessarily for the good. Sometimes it improved things, sometimes it complicated. And the second thing was what I call the insidious increase in governmentally imposed centralism. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. 1936, Winifred Holtby, Yorkshire lass, wrote South Riding, and she wrote, local government has considerable importance in its effect on human life. Now, the French are out in force in Jersey today. It's splashed over the front of the BBC News. But is it more important than the fact that they put the car parking charges up in Baildon? Well, it's a moot point, obviously, but for many people, what happens locally is actually pretty important, and sometimes it pushes other things into the background. So in the 1960s, local government was still very strong indeed. If you think back then, local councils were very accessible. Queensbury, Shipley, all had town halls, and you could, if you were a local resident, you could walk in and take issues up with somebody who probably was quite close to the service you were asking about. Large stock of local housing. Now, you're Bradford West. I'm not very good on Bradford West. I have to apologise. I tended to work most of my years in what I call the northeast segment of Bradford. So if you think about Bradford as a bit of a circular thing, Manningham Lane runs north to the city, well, the old city boundary, and to the east goes Leeds Road. And in that segment alone, we had 6 or 7 major council estates: Thorpe Edge, with its great big York House, Ravenscliffe, Thackley, Bradford Moor, and Swain House. And all of that housing was managed in Bradford. It was managed by the Bradford Council. You think about services like welfare provided to people who needed welfare support, mental health services in those days and up until 74 were provided by the council. And then local justice for our JP friend was local. It was very local indeed. And local courts were run independently by local magistrates drawn from local people. And there were no stipes or stipendiary magistrates or district judges knocking about in those days. Well, there were the odd one or two. Hull had one, and I think Leeds might have had one. I'm not sure on that latter point. In fact, in the 70s, I think there were 300 magistrates in Bradford, sitting on roughly divided into 100 each, sitting on 3 weekly rotas. And things were very much more local. So go back to the 60s. First man in space, Mr. Gagarin, wasn't up there for very long, was he? But he was in 61. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy was assassinated. I can't even say that with these teeth. Kennedy was assassinated in 63. And before anybody asks, I can't remember where I was when the news came up. Everybody seems to be able to, but I certainly can't. BBC Two commenced in 64. And the first man on the moon in 69 was only 66 years since the Wright brothers first took their short flight. And what a way we'd come technologically there. Major state employers, British Railways, National Coal Board. There were then major industries, construction, engineering, and locally, of course, textiles. Men had a near monopoly on manual work, even despite the fact that during the Second World War, many women took on jobs in factories and things. But after the war, that changed. And many women, of course, had to leave work because of childcare related issues. So here we go. Here's the modern equipment from the offices of the 1960s. Now, in our office in Bradford, I'll mention that in a little while, we had about 7 clericals. Now, wash my mouth out. Whoever uses the word clericals anymore? And these wonderful ladies were so dubbed, but their job was jolly hard. They were typing an awful lot of the day on those typewriters on the left. That was a relatively modern 1960s one. Remember the carbon paper in red there? And of course, if you put it in the wrong way round, it came out as a mirror image on the back of the sheet that you wanted to send to the person. And look at the bottom one, a bander machine. A bander machine was required to provide enough court reports. We might have had to take about 6 reports to the court. 3 magistrates, the clerk, a defence and a prosecuting solicitor all needed a copy. And of course it required you typing onto a skin, which caused indentations in the skin when the little arm came up from the typewriter, and that then went through the bander machine. But if you'd made about 5 or 6 mistakes when you were typing it, you couldn't scrub them out. You had to go back to the beginning. Tough times, tough hard work that was. But we did have one modern aid, and that was called cut and paste. And that's it, 1960s style. I don't like really mentioning the French, but this little quote interested me. If you really want to understand a man, you should look at what his world was like in the year that he was 21. That's quite an interesting concept to me, and I think that bears some truth. I mean, when I was 21, the thoughts of a mobile phone were decades away. These things that we're now all communicating on, well, they didn't exist. Well, they might have done somewhere, but they took up a huge room just for one tiny computer. And the other big thing that I do like to mention is language. What a change in our language. Words that we would have used in 1960s are now, pardon me, no longer thought to be right to use. And if you ever look back at the novelists of the day, Neville Shooter's a good example, the language there certainly wouldn't pass muster today. And as many of you look as though you might have passed retirement age, I think many of us have done really, really well to begin to adapt to technology and to begin to change our language. It's not been easy, and we never get any gratitude for that, but that's life, isn't it? Where did the probation service come from? Well, in the 1850s and onwards, because there was no welfare state, charity work grew. I wrote that, and then I thought to myself, well, we've got a welfare state, but where will we be without charity? Just the same, it's still a huge thing. And in the late 1800s, the Church of England Temperance Society, I bet you can tell what that did from the tin, can't you? The Church of England Temperance Society decided that there were far too many drunks appearing day after day after day in the magistrates' courts in London, and so they decided that they should send somebody to see if they could rescue these drunks. And what do churches send? They send missionaries. And ironically, many of the first probation officers were drawn from the ranks of those missionaries. It's a two-pronged thing as to how the probation order developed. That was going to be the officers who were going to service it, but why was it required? Well, the original suspended sentence, that involving a rope and a trap door, had been used quite extensively. It was a bit much for thieving a loaf of bread to use that. Transportation was coming to an end. The cricket team in Australia was quite sufficient. And the debtors' prisons were full. And courts were looking at ways of bringing in a new sentence of some sort. The conditional discharge plus supervision equals probation order. And the conditional discharge today still remains on the statute books and arguably is one of the best well, it's not actually a sentence, but the sentence that you can pass in a court. Because what it says is, we don't want people to come back before the courts. We want them to never come before us again, if at all possible. So the conditional discharge says, look, we'll hang this, if we won't punish you today, we'll hang this over you for a year, a couple of years, 3 years. And provided you don't commit any more offences, that's the end of it, nothing else. But if you do, then not only will we punish you for the thing that you've done new, but we'll punish you for the old thing as well. Very nice concept. Problem was that people would either forget that they were on probation or life events would overtake them. So it was decided that they needed somebody to keep an eye on them. And the original probation officers, in inverted commas, were ministers of religion, other local worthies, who actually said they'd sort of stand surety for the young person and would take it upon themselves to remind them periodically to be a good boy. It mainly was boys. And the idea of the probation order was a tripartite agreement. It was an agreement between the court, the offender, and an intermediary. You see, the court could not, of its own self, keep these people under constant review. So they needed somebody to do it for them. And that intermediary, or the probation officer, as it turned out ultimately, was the one that they turned to. First, Probation of Offenders Act 1907, and straight away you begin to develop a structure because they needed to have people employed as probation officers. They couldn't be, they'd got to move away from these volunteers, and many police court missionaries came on board, and the general idea was that they would be run by the local magistrates. So the local magistrates ran the probation service. And from the very beginning, there was gender equality. And ironically, that's due to male paternalism, because the view was that you couldn't have a woman supervising a man or a man supervising a woman who was on probation. Well, I guess you probably know how many people are on probation today. And the answer is none. And that's because in 1991, they did away with the old probation order, and they should have done away with the title probation officer, because more realistically these days, they're corrections officers. They're not probation officers, although the name remains because we don't like to get rid of these things. And I wouldn't like to answer the last question on that list of where the service is now, because sadly, a certain Mr. Grayling got involved about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a bit more now, and decimated the idea by selling so much of it off to the Sercos of this world. Anyway, don't let me go any further on that. I might get in trouble. Right, this report telling the court what their inquiries were. My report is based on interviews at the office with Billy and several sessions at his home with his mother. Well, I never got any reports like that, may I tell you, sadly. There we go. 1969, although I'm not sure this picture was, well, sure this picture wasn't in 1969, but in 1969, that door that you see to the near right of the picture was the entrance to the Bradford Magistrates Court. About 6 courts within the town hall building, City Hall building. There's number 1 court, still in existence, used. You can go and have a look around it if you want to. And our bench was on the left-hand side. The 3 red seats in the middle looked to the left, and we sat facing into the well of the court, the dock in front of you. It was also used for the quarter sessions, which ran in those days. Many of you are mooted, so I would have asked you where you thought that was, and I'm sure somebody would have recognised a picture from the 1970s with the junction of Vicar Lane, the main route in from Wakefield sort of area, and Hallings. And the big concrete and glass building you see is actually in the place where a warehouse once stood. Well, there were a couple of warehouses there going all the way down to the 2 buildings you see on the left. And one of them was ours, a converted wool warehouse, rabbit warren of a place. A wonderful place to work. The wall there, it, of course, is into what was the goods yard for the station. It now houses the Crown Court. My career started in that building there and ended up in the Crown Court some 30 odd years later. And we moved in 1974 to the City Court, so not this side of the building, the other side of the building. So who employed the probation staff? Well, because of our relationship with local magistrates, they hired and fired us. I was appointed by magistrates. Unfortunately, I wasn't fired by them. They moved into the background after the reforms of the 80s and 90s. The administration of the service was very, very low level. We had a principal officer, not a chief, first among equals. Senior officers couldn't tell you what to do. Magistrates could tell you what to do. And therefore, we were very much independent professionals with our watchwords of advise, assist, and befriend. What did we do? Reports to the criminal courts, now called pre-sentence reports. Reports to civil and domestic courts, custody and access to children. Neighbour disputes and consents to marry. Yeah, consents to marry in the magistrates' court up until 1971. Any other social work the magistrates wanted to do. And often if a defendant was umming and ahhing about his plea, don't tell any solicitors this, they'd say to us, oh, take him outside, Mr. Kenure, have a word with him and see if you could encourage him one way or another, lad. And so we would do that. Sentence management, including supervising those on probation, youngsters on licence from approved school, detention centre, Borstal, adults released on life licence, and those released from special hospitals like Rampton, Broadmoor, and the like. We had a professional approach to things, and these, I think, would probably describe our professional tenets. Treating clients, which was what we called them, now that word has been banned in the modern parlance of the service. They are offenders. Okay, you may as well call it what you want, but this shows the shift between those days and now. Not arguing one is better than the other, and merely making the point of how different things were. Treating clients as individuals, allowing them to express feelings, maintaining a professional distance, being non-judgmental, accepting the right of self-determination, and maintaining confidentiality. A man commits an offence after a wake at a funeral. The court may feel his actions are of grave concern. Well, you can see how they went there, can't you, really? Okay, nearly there. The triggers for crime, as we used to see them, were probably personal functioning related issues, inadequate socialisation, the way you were brought up, one's own or the person's own mental ill health, or maybe current family dysfunction. And so the practical issues that they might have faced were a social situation, for example, of poverty, unemployment, or bad peer group influences. And we would jointly agree work plans, and they might include practical issues like getting accommodation. You can never get away from offending if you've got nowhere to live. Maybe employment issues, addiction issues, and of course in those days alcohol was the principal one. Of course that's changed to the current drugs. And the social setting issues, well, we would work jointly. You know, I spent a lot of my time in houses on Thorpe Edge, Ravenscliffe and wherever, discussing with spouses, partners and parents about how they as well could help me to work with their offending member of family, encouraging people to develop new interests, and also enabling them maybe to move away from the peers who are so vitally influential, particularly with youngsters. Slip of the pen. Whilst acknowledging that prostitution is a problem in this area, I have to inform the court we have no officers trained in this work. Well, that's always allegedly. Oh, I wrote a book about the thing, the whole of my heydays. I don't wish to sell it to you. It's very much a niche thing, but if you were terribly, terribly interested, it's on Amazon. Much more interesting is my more recent novel about 1963, but that's cheeky to throw that in. But there were, you know, it's worth a try. So to summarise, who were we? Independent professionals, working with local people, working for local courts, having an interest in our local community, and left alone by central government. Wasn't it great? Those heyday officers had a vocation to work with offenders, faith in the ability of offenders to change, and faith in the principles of social work. This young man divides his time between servicing his motorbike and his girlfriend. Yeah, many of them did that. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope it's been of interest.